Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's edition of the Seekers Forum. I hope you're having a great weekend. I've been thinking a lot about contradiction lately. Like many of you, I find myself looking out at world events in a state of sheer disbelief. Just wondering how it is that a single species can be so completely fractured. How can we be capable of such transcendent acts of brilliance and kindness and generosity, and at the same time capable of committing such heinous crimes against not only humanity, but against the earth itself? I ask myself, as you must as well, how can a sane person with feelings make sense of such mind-bending and heartbreaking paradox? What does it tell us about our capacity for internal conflict? Are human beings simply destined to feel divided and at odds with ourselves and other people, perpetually? Will we always be at war within ourselves? Or is there another approach that allows for human contradiction, inconsistency, ambiguity, partiality, even at times hypocrisy, without losing the awareness of the wholeness underneath? In other words, how can we ride the waves of conflict without forgetting that we are, in fact, the ocean? Does spirit have enough space for opposites to exist without being at war with ourselves? And if so, how do we find our way to that place as seekers, where we're not in an endless internal battle and able to integrate our own extremes, not only as individuals, but also as a species? We find the answer to this question in our definition of what it means to be whole. For spiritual idealists, wholeness is sometimes imagined to be a perfect state where their sense of self is never challenged, they never feel insecure, and they're able to express the best of themselves while keeping all the other parts locked away in the shadows. This idealized version of wholeness promises harmony, balance, and well-being, but without any discord or lopsidedness or misery. This smiley face version of what it means to be whole has little basis in reality, of course, but the fact that it isn't true hardly dents the facade of the spiritual idealist, who is somebody who insists on seeing the pony, so to speak, while refusing to acknowledge that metaphorical pile of crap that it came with. Now, this sanitized version of wholeness rings false to a spiritual realist, on the other hand. We know, as spiritual realists, how complicated, eccentric, and even bestial we can be from one day to the next, while being transparent and loving and inspired on another day. We're well aware that every human being contains a motley crew of many different characters jumbled together, impulses running on different channels, stories that are colliding in different contexts, feelings that are tossing us hither and yon. Spiritual realists have very few illusions about who we are. When it comes to the contrast of our own checkered nature, we're virtually unshockable. We don't waste a lot of time railing against our humanity or longing for perfection. We're just hoping for a little more peace, a little more love, a healthy dose of acceptance and empathy. To be, as Dan Harris put it in his book about meditation, 10% happier. We know as spiritual realists that in order for this to happen, we must sooner or later confront ourselves naked in the three-way mirror of mindfulness. There's no way around it. All the sags and lumps and bumps and scars that coexist with our pretty parts. Learning to see ourselves in the round, the beauty as well as the ruins. We're afforded a glimpse of how it might be to feel whole instead of fragmented, to be allies to ourselves instead of antagonists. We learn to live in paradox, in fact, to appreciate the two-sided nature of things, and to relish in the strangeness of being human, The strangeness of being human is a big part of this experience. We come to distrust ideals because we know where they lead. Ideals lead toward, or idealism rather, leads toward fundamentalism, aggression, censorship, and away from the truth, which is always many sided and open to change. Realists come to appreciate the value of patience and mercy, knowing that despite our amazing potential for growth, our limitations are equally real. A wise person, after all, is someone who never pretends to have fewer failings than he does. Does that make him complacent? Of course not. He does everything he can to make wise choices, stay awake, and be a loving, dependable human being. But he knows that sooner or later he will fall short. He will backslide, he'll forget, he'll be inconsistent, and that is exactly as it should be. And this is where people get confused. But life itself is inconsistent, and it's bound to disappoint sooner or later. It's spiritually naive not to know this. As Emerson put it famously, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. We are hybrid creatures. We're sort of like spiritual platypuses, animals that have mismatched parts, but a beauty all our own when they're stitched together. If the funny-looking platypus is evidence that God has a sense of humor, then human beings are actually the final punchline. Because in our contrariness, we offer proof positive that the sublime coexists with the ridiculous, that the senseless coexists with the sensible, the mortal with the eternal, the practical with the flamboyant. All of these exist within us. And if we fail to recognize that, we miss out on a great deal of what it means to be alive. As the British psychologist D.W. Winnicott put it, we are poor indeed if we are only sane. We're poor indeed if we are only sane. It's our inconsistencies, after all, that give us character. The word character comes from the Greek root for etching, as if experience were inscribing itself across us in a pattern of wrinkles and fractures and craters that create a unique picture of how it is and how it was for us as individuals to be alive. There's a famous story about the Italian actress Anna Magnani on the set of one of her movies. I believe it was in the 1950s. And her makeup man was trying to make her look younger than she was for her close-up for that day. But Magnani refused. She pushed his hand away and she said, "Don't take out a single wrinkle. I paid for every line on this face." Don't take out a single wrinkle. I paid for every line on this face. For the actress, who had been a great beauty in her youth and was now kind of a dowdy middle-aged woman, telling the truth as an artist meant revealing the damage, showing the ruins of what life had done to her. Because that would enable her to do her job, which was to reflect the truth of the human condition. She wasn't trying to put up a whitewashed version of what it means to be alive. Anna Magnani understood as a great artist that conflict creates pathos, that pathos is the lifeblood of empathy, and that empathy is the heart of the human condition. Such connection was far more important to her than whitewashing the signs of her immortality. And on a spiritual level, we face the same crossroads. Do we use our practice and the seeker's journey to whitewash our flaws and conceal our inconsistencies? To construct a make-believe idol, IDOL of self, in order to hide our mortal weakness? Do we build ourselves up as heroes to earn the admiration of others and hide our insecurities? Or do we lay ourselves bare, spiritually speaking? Do we kick vanity and self-protection and ego to the curb? Do we imagine that in order to be loved, we must only be seen as strong and good? Or do we understand that wholeness is its own reward? The ability to live without shame. And that whether we're admired or not, whether we're viewed as wise and compassionate or not, The honest seeker would rather be authentically complicated than pretend to be more unwrinkled and one-dimensional than we actually are. There's a reason that the ancient Greeks gave every dramatic hero a tragic flaw. There's a reason that in spiritual literature, it's often the scoundrels, the converts, and the ne'er-do-wells whose stories move us most profoundly. Think of Milarepa, the murderer turned saint in Tibetan Buddhism, or think of Saint Augustine, who longed for chastity but not yet. We're touched by their stories precisely because the protagonists aren't perfect and don't pretend to be. We're inspired by them to be better people because they've had the courage to show the cracks in their mask. Because in their own trials and tribulations, we see mirrors of our own slings and arrows, and the possibility of rising above them if we integrate the divine with the human. The beauty of these stories and their cathartic effect on us depend on the contradictions and the flaws. Courage that comes easily and never flags is far less inspiring and powerful. It's an important thing to remember. Courage that comes easily and never weakens is far less inspiring. And the same goes for spiritual beauty. Think of the Japanese tradition of wabi-sabi, where flawed beauty is considered far more compelling than untouched, pristine prettiness. The word wabi refers to the loneliness of living in nature, a universal condition for all creatures. And sabi points to the beauty or serenity that comes with age, when the life of the object and its impermanence are evidenced in its patina and its wear, even its visible repairs. Wabi-sabi centers on the acceptance of transience and imperfection and is based on three realities of Buddhism. Nothing lasts, nothing is finished, and nothing is perfect. This aesthetic is based on paradox, and it can change our perception of the world to the extent that a chip or a crack in a vase, for example, makes it more interesting, and it gives the object greater meditative value. The shadow behind our light makes it more compelling, you could say. Inconsistency, as Emerson points out, is the sign of a vibrant, living, growing person who doesn't pretend to know all the answers and sees life as a classroom where mistakes are made and sometimes become the seeds of success, the points of beauty, the image of truth and life as it is with all its cracks and all of its bruises. But what do we do with our own contradictions? How do we allow for our mismatched parts? When desire meets reason, in your own life, for example, how do you sway? Are you pulled toward sense or not making sense, toward logic or toward mystery? Do you believe that the whole is indeed greater than its parts and that integrating contradiction makes us bigger and stronger? Or do you fight against your weakness and struggle to maintain a mask of keeping calm and carrying on? We come to discover as we look at these questions that we are far more interesting and poignant than we imagine, pulled in so many directions at once, struggling to do the right thing. I'd just like to discuss three areas in particular where paradox and inconsistency and contradiction are especially challenging on the seeker's path. The first is spiritual aspiration itself. Nothing is more paradoxical than spiritual life or the call to enlightenment. In a very real sense, the desire for spiritual liberation, so to speak, is the desire to become nobody. The seeker understands that while he or she has an individual self with peculiarities that are original, who we are is not this body-mind personality. The wave is not the wave is part of the sea. Okay? Beyond the bodies that we are is the consciousness that sustains and embodies us beyond the limits of the personal self. Spiritual life is about identifying with essence over form, remembering what we are, using the body-mind to navigate through life while knowing that this thing we see in the mirror is not the underlying force that animates it. the intelligence beyond what the mind understands. This is so paradoxical. It's such a deep riddle. We are a thing that uses its thing parts to wake up to the fact that it's not a thing at all. Wisdom teachings are generally paradoxical in nature. The thing you're looking for is the thing that is looking. What is the sound of one hand clapping? It sounds crazy to the rational mind to aspire to be nobody, but that's exactly what seekers are doing. Detaching our consciousness by whatever practice we use from the limits of our personality in order to know ourselves more profoundly. The ego fears its dissolution. It warns us that we're going to lose power in the world. But in fact, the opposite is true, because the less identified we are with personality, the more effective we become as human beings. The more creatively we're able to use our particular wave to make a splash. Okay? Wisdom is paradox in action. And our lives and our paths are about working the edge between these two dimensions. The next area of confusion and challenge on the seeker's path is ordinary love. And I'm calling it ordinary love because I'm talking about loving with an imperfect, nearsighted, frequently self-centered body-mind, whose appetites and instincts, many of them, run directly counter to love. How can we love another human being without failing on a regular basis? It's impossible. Failing to see their side of the story, failing to put their needs on a par with your own, failing to understand what they're desperately trying to say to you, and also failing to make yourself understood when your heart is just bursting. But try as you might to connect, you still feel thousands of miles away. Love is the ultimate humbling path that also often contains humiliation as well, when we're confronted by our own limitations, our pettiness, our fear, our coldness. The most loving person can also be cold. The most generous person can also be stingy and selfish. When needs collide in a relationship, or you're angry or sad, or you're not feeling well, or your expectations are at odds with the expectations of the other. Or when you turn out to be acting together, but in very different movies with separate storylines, only to realize your mistake and that who you thought the person was or what you thought your relationship was about isn't what it is at all. And then suffering the embarrassment or the anger or the self-judgment that comes with that realization. My Polish cousin used to say that love doesn't come with wheels, meaning that it doesn't just roll along. It has to be carried, it has to be pushed, and it sometimes needs to be dragged. Love will fight against us. It will get stuck in the mud. And sometimes the ground underneath it will just dry up, which makes progress together almost impossible. Human love, ordinary love, is a mass of inconsistencies and contradictions. And the paradox is that it's just at these moments of conflict and paralysis, when we can't move forward another inch, but force ourselves to stay anyway, to abide with love through the bad parts. It's precisely in those moments that the heart gets its best workout. I love this quote of Thomas Merton's, which I believe I've told you before, but it couldn't be more perfect. Merton said, "Love and prayer are learned in the hour when prayer and love are learned in the hour when prayer becomes impossible and the heart has turned to stone." Prayer and love are learned in the hour when prayer becomes impossible and the heart is turned to stone. Because the difficulty of love is exactly what helps to give it meaning. And finally, mortality, the question of impermanence, is the ultimate paradox, another ultimate paradox on the spiritual path. As spiritual seekers, we tend to live with a more deliberate than usual awareness of death. Indeed, the contemplation of our own mortality is considered to be the fast track to enlightenment, because it forces us to de-identify with the body-mind and ask the question of whether there's anything beyond this body, whether there's a divine or a transcendent dimension, or is what you see what you get? I remember as a little boy opening a trash can lid. I must have been 7 or 8 years old, and seeing a dead blue jay on a pile of newspapers. And I just stood there staring at this thing, wondering if this bloody pile of bones and feathers was the bird, or if the bird was the thing that had flown away, had gotten away. That was my first conscious awareness of the mystery of death, and it's never left me. All human beings, to some degree or other, think about this, but some of us much more willingly than others. As seekers, we look willingly at the things that many people, a majority of people, spend their time trying to avoid. It's precisely those riddles, those unanswerable questions, or those scary places that draw us forward, because we know that the truth is hiding there. I had another realization recently about this ageless, unafraid part of us. You know the cliche about not feeling your age. That no matter how old you are, there's still this young person inside you that looks in the mirror in disbelief and wondering who that old person is. I was thinking how strange it is that this young self inside never quite gets the memo about aging. When I suddenly realized that this part of me and the part of everyone people I speak, everyone I know has had this experience of not feeling their age. I suddenly realized that this sense of not being one's age is precisely that ageless part, that eternal self that spiritual traditions talk about. It's that part of oneself that's untouched by time. It's also the part of oneself that, while you're dying, looks out at the world through those same young eyes in disbelief at the drama that's playing out around you. I used to volunteer in hospice, and often I would be sitting with very old people who looked so young and vibrant. It's like the spirit inside them was shining out so visibly, because the personality had worn away. The closer they got to death, the younger they seemed. And I realized that transcendence and awakening has everything to do with connecting to this ageless quality within oneself and recognizing that it is our true nature. And that's what we're called on to do as the only self-conscious animals on the planet, the only animals that know that we're going to die and need to live with that awareness throughout our lives. And yet find meaning in existence and give it our best. I wrote a book called Ethical Wisdom. There's a passage in it I'd like to read to you that captures this. I wrote, quote, "This is the cosmic joke after all, having hardware that can measure our own diminishment, predict and study our own extinction, sift through the ashes of what we become, and discover that we're made of stardust." That's the paradox of being a human being. We're asked to take 40 or 60 or 80 years contemplating the arc of our own mortality, to live as if this life matters. And it does, while knowing that the wave is only a wave and that it will disappear into the below the surface of the ocean. As seekers, we look for the bird's eye view of the wave so that we understand ourselves in the context of our greater nature. And that's what spiritual practice is all about. It's applying that two-sided, contradictory, paradoxical wisdom. Learning to harness our own minds and step beyond the limiting identity as the be-all and end-all of our existence in order to see ourselves and understand ourselves for what we actually are. The seeker's life is all about touching into the essential truth. And the essential truth is that nothing has one side. And that we are far more complicated and fascinating than we give ourselves credit for. So that's what I wanted to say to you today about paradox and contradiction and inconsistency. And now I'd love to open up the lines and hear what you have to say about your own experience with being contradictory and being paradoxical. How do you make sense of this in your own life? Do you find yourselves suffering from idealism? Or are you really able to look at your shadow side as well as your brighter side with equal acceptance and equal love? That's really the question.